Family's Therapy Corner. I'm Ole von Frausing-Borch, and I'm the host of the show. And I just want to welcome you here to a show where what we try to do is explain, educate, even entertain about things, all things psychological in nature. And today we have a very special guest. This is a second coming on our show for Miss Avigail. Almost blew it again there, Avigail. Avigail Gimple, who comes all the way to us from Israel. And just as a real brief introduction, Avigail got her graduate studies or primary graduate studies done in New York. Then you got married first and then moved to Israel, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
2 days later.
2 days later, wow.
Yeah.
And continued graduate studies there in Israel. And at one point even went to Moscow for what, 3 years, was it?
Yeah, 3.5 years.
Wow. And did some work there. And then she has returned to Israel, and now she teaches both at the Herzog College and lectures in Israeli schools and to parent groups all over Israel, and has a private practice. And you train parents to become better ADHD coaches to their children, and also to the spouses to learn a new love language to communicate with respect. She recently published a book, which was just first time you were on the show was that right after that, on hyperhealing, and it's based on her many years of research and practice, both as a mother of a good number of kids with ADHD. And Avigail, you have 6 children, right?
I sure do. One of them just walked in and she's walking right back out again.
And
Yes.
anyway, and now she's got a second book coming out called Hyperhealing, Show Me the Science. And that's basically what we're going to talk about. But I also want to talk about the recent training that you did. So first off, welcome, Abigail, and good evening there, right? It's morning here, but
That's right.
I'm in my office here in Santa Maria. That's not a false background. That's the real background.
Well, I still have some light if you see from the window.
Oh, yeah.
So we're both catching the sunlight together.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So first off, I want to hear about the training that you just did. Explain to us what that was all about.
Okay, so I'll start by doing a tiny little background that I wrote the book Hyperhealing, the original book, because what I saw was, first of all, as a young mom, when my kids were being diagnosed one after the next with ADHD, I had no idea where to turn. And the only real options I had were medication. And I didn't even know that there was anything else out there. And it was either go with the medication and meet your doctor twice a year, or pay a tremendous amount for therapy, which young couples usually can't afford. And I certainly couldn't have it at that time. So I went with the advice I was being given, and it didn't sit well with me. I felt like I'm looking at my children and I'm saying, these are healthy kids. They're struggling. Something's going on. What is that thing that's going on? I have to get to the bottom of it. So it was a very isolated kind of time. And I thought to myself, I really need to present a program. I need to first create a program. And as a special education teacher myself, it was natural for me. And I started just drilling down and trying to figure out what was going on with my own children, with my students, with my clients. And that's how the book really was born, because I wanted to be able to put something out there for every single parent that they would be able to turn to one place and get very, very clear, concise information and an intervention plan. So that was the goal. And what I said throughout the years, as I was gathering information for my clients, and as you mentioned in your introduction, these parent groups that I've been teaching all over Israel. It sounds very dramatic when you say teaching all over Israel. Israel is kind of the size of New Jersey. So teaching all over Israel is not as dramatic as it sounds, but I have been teaching in many places. And what I notice is this material that I'm giving over to parents and turning them into coaches for their own children is much more powerful when we learn it as a group, because they're not just listening to me, they're listening to each other. And you walk into this group setting and you feel like such a failure of a parent Like how am I producing kids who can't sit in class? And the school is telling you that your kid is a failure of a child and telling you to fix that child. So you really feel bad about yourself. And then you walk into a group of really normal parents. Everyone is doing good things and is intelligent and is trying to go in the right direction and getting the same messages as you. Just that is powerful. So I'll get to your question. Your question was, what am I doing with this training? And the training is basically to take my book and train trainers so that they can lead groups. That was my big, giant goal and dream, was not to leave it as a book, but rather to be able to use the book as a springboard for anyone to be able to invite their friends or their church or synagogue group and be able to lead as a fellow parent. So I offered a free training because I'm so passionate about this, that parents be able to get the help they need in a group setting without having to spend a lot of money, which they don't have. So that's what I've been up to recently.
Wow, that's quite an undertaking. I'm impressed, and there's a part of me that feels very proud of you in having done that, because as someone with ADHD, and there's work that needs to be done out there for those of us who have it. Now, unfortunately, I grew up without knowing I had it, and being raised, well, I'm Danish American, raised in a very Danish home. You didn't sit still; you got smacked. That was their idea. Yeah, that was their idea of how to deal with someone who was hyperactive. So
listen, I got smacked whether I sat still or moved. So,
oh dear, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
Oh yeah. So yeah, but I had that problem when I went to school too. It was like sitting there and not paying attention and being treated like I was dumb, and the teachers thought I was retarded, and far from it. But I had to go to a psychologist to prove that. So it's been a tortuous route. So that's why I say I'm kind of proud of what you're doing, because it feels so good to hear someone who's reaching out to people and offering training to lead groups to help people to understand how to deal with ADHD in a non-medicinal way.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So new book coming out. I love the title.
Thank you. Yeah, some people might think it's a little bit in your face, but I've never shied away from in your face. I think that's how I got to where I am today. So that's okay. A little dose of chutzpah, as we call it.
Right.
Yeah, in the original pronunciation. Yeah, so the book Hyperhealing Show Me the Science really was the beginning of my journey, even though it's the book that's coming out second, because I am just curious by nature. I need to know everything. So I start by digging into the studies. What's going on? What's the studies on Ritalin? The doctor just gave me a prescription for Ritalin. I want to understand, when did this show up on the scene, and what's it for, and how does it work, and what does it do to the child's brain, and what are the studies that corroborate this or support the information the doctor's giving me? Are there any studies that support that? So I went just digging, and I loved it. I loved it. It's a little bit nerdy. I appreciate that, but it was really fun for me. And when I dug down into just the history of ADHD, and where do we get the first diagnoses, and why is it going up? Why is it, if it's something that's genetic, should it not stay stable? We don't have genetic epidemics, right? That's impossible. So therefore, why is it going up? What's happening with that? So all of these questions really were bugging me. And so basically, if you just want to know what's going on with your kid and what to do about it, the first book is your book. But if you're curious like me and you're not scared of asking questions, then this is the book that's so joyful, because it really takes a journey, and it was a lot of fun to write. And even when I read it over and over again, through the editing process, they say that the beginning of the editing process is like your honeymoon. And by the time it's over, you can't even look at the book. You hate it. And with book 2, that didn't happen, because every time I read it, I'm like, that is interesting. So it kept being interesting. So I'm hoping that the people who read it feel the same way about it.
Well, let me remind everybody, the new book that's coming out is called Hyper Healing, Show Me the Science. And we'll have a posting on at the end of the interview with the two books so that people can look it up. Yeah, so what kind of things did you find interesting? Because, well, let me share with you, because when I was working on my master's degree, we were in a seminar for a semester where there was about 10 or 12 of us in this particular class, and each one of us was supposed to present each week a piece of research, and we're to analyze it from beginning to end, from abstract to conclusion, and share those results with the class. So think about it. You got 17 weeks, you got, let's just round it off, 10 people. That's 170 studies that we went through during that course of that seminar. Not one of them was perfect. Not one.
Right.
Now,
no, you don't never have a perfect study.
No, but the one thing and I share this with my class when I teach, is that, even though none of them were perfect, each one had something to share of importance. And sometimes, you go off, and you find this in research, where you go off to prove one thing and it ends up being totally wrong. But that's important information too.
Sure.
So
Which is why I love studies.
Yeah. So share with me. I'm
Okay. So I'll tell you where I began. I began by looking at the imaging studies for ADHD, because the narrative that we're very familiar with is that ADHD is a neurobiological, neurobehavioral disorder, which means that the assumption is that there's something wrong with a person's brain. Now, obviously, our brains and our bodies are connected to each other. So if we behave in a certain way for long enough, it affects our brain and our neurotransmitters. That's true of any behavior. But the question is, are these children born with an altered brain? Is their brain different at birth? And is that what's causing all of this mess? Because if that's the case, then it would make sense that we would have a medication that realigns their brain. That sounds very medically sound. But is the story our true story? So that's where I began. And I just want to say at the outset that I did not use any fringe studies. All the studies that I analyzed were studies that you could find in the mainstream, every single one of them. And I was careful about that because I didn't want anyone to think that I had a leaning in either direction. I was really looking for the truth. And I also, as a mother, had medicated my own children. So it's not like I was coming into it with, this anti anything. There was no anti, there was curiosity, and that's where I wanted to go with it. So I start looking at the CTs, MRIs, fMRIs to find out what they're looking for and what are they finding. So they always have, in the abstract of most of these studies, you're going to find that there's some kind of altered brain in the study group, and then you have the comparison group where you're not going to find anything. So in the CTs, interestingly, this is early 80s. When they had already declared that it was neurological in some way, but they only really started doing the studies in the late 70s, early 80s. So they really didn't have that information. It was kind of like a guess back then. Mm-hmm. And the CT studies turned up nothing, meaning that the brains of kids with ADHD behaviors and the brains of kids without were identical. They couldn't find anything. Okay, so a CT is not particularly strong enough, so we move into MRIs. In the 90s, MRIs are turning up some interesting information. And suddenly we're finding differences between children with ADHD and children without ADHD. One particular study that I spent some time talking about in the book is a study by a researcher called Castellanos. And Castellanos, in his research in the mid-90s, he says there are areas of the brain of the kids with ADHD symptoms that are altered. The frontal lobe is smaller. There are other areas that seem different. But 1 second, 98% of the kids in my study group are medicated, and none of the kids in my comparison group are medicated. So there is the strong possibility that it's the medication that's causing these alterations in the brain. So it's interesting that a couple of studies follow it, And they all have majority of their study subjects medicated, but none of them ask the same question, even though Castellanos had already asked it. They just ignore it and they carry on. They say, we found it. ADHD is neurological. It's all there in the brain. But Castellanos himself, and to give him credit, he says, I need to do another study. 2002, he does another study. And lo and behold, using kids with no medication use, he finds that the kids with ADHD have a smaller brain and different areas that are altered. Now, so everyone runs with that. This is like big headlines everywhere. And if you read the abstract and the conclusion, you have all the information you need to support the fact that there's a brain disorder and we need to fix it with medication. But if you actually go into the study, you find something extremely interesting. And that is that the children in the ADHD symptoms group, our study group, are 2 years younger on average than the kids in the comparison group, which means that if you're not comparing apples to apples, you're comparing smaller brains to larger brains. And that's not sound science. That's very problematic. Yeah. And according to his study, the FDA declares that this is neurological and therefore the best treatment for it would be medication. Now, if we go back and we looked at his first study, we would say that would be quite a blow to the pharmaceutical companies. Mm-hmm. Because if the drugs are causing a brain problem, that's a blowout piece of information, because that means that it could be causing problems down the line, depression or passivity or other psychiatric disorders, which we find kids who are medicated are way more likely to develop other psychiatric disorders as they get older than kids who are unmedicated. And I'm talking about two groups of kids with ADHD. We don't see any kids with ADHD in the non-medicated group that are developing. You can't say any, but the percentage is almost non-existent of kids who are developing ADHD, other neurological psychiatric symptoms in the non-medicated group, but 1 in 10 in the medicated group. So this had to be buried pretty quickly. And I think Castellanos covered his tracks there, and everyone else ignored it for a reason.
Oh, Lordy. Yeah, the research is fascinating for a variety of reasons. Like I said, going back to the seminar thing, we've noticed that in terms of, control group versus experimental group, how do they match up? And you just pointed out a very interesting fact there, where the control group was 2 years older. It's like, hello,
Yeah.
not okay. They need to be matched, and they weren't. So these flaws, as we call them in research, really need to be paid attention to. That's why, unfortunately, like I do, I read the abstract and I read the conclusion, and then I'm done. And it's like, you better go back and read how they did it.
Right. And it's all in there. And that's what's nice about studies. They put all the charts in there. You can follow it. You can see it if you care to.
Yeah. But the other thing I want to just sort of touch on is the changes over time, and changes due to what? Medication, environment, what? Because I'm trying to remember his name. I think it's Dr. Amen who does the studies with the MRI where
it is.
Yeah, he checks you, does an MRI before therapy, does it after therapy, and oh my God, there's brain changes.
Right. He's interesting because he's kind of a lone ranger, and no one has corroborated his work. I have his book. I've read it. I've seen his work, but I'm not jumping on his bandwagon, only because it's like kind of like a vitamin company letting you know that how well their vitamin works, but they don't have any external studies. Now, it could be that he's doing unbelievable work and his stuff is fantastic, but until he allows other people to double check his work and see exactly what's going on, I'm gonna wait to comment.
Well, the reason I brought him up was because if, in fact, what he's saying is legitimate, that brain changes can be affected by therapy or whatever, it sort of goes back to what you're talking about in your research analysis, in that which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it the medication? Was it the ADHD? Was it the environment? Was it the ADHD? Was it genetic? Or was, brain changes? Okay. And the only reason I brought up Amen is because of the fact that he's trying to show that there can be brain changes just from therapy. Well,
Sure.
okay.
And I'm with him on that 100%. And the truth is, in my first book, I discuss how parents could help their children make brain changes.
Mhm.
And that is through creating new habits. Every new habit that you create, you get a new neurotransmitter.
Right.
Every new learning that you do, it strengthens your brain. And
Right.
therefore, on that, there's no argument there. That's great.
Yeah. So what else did you find out in your research on research?
Okay, so
What did
another study that I spent a good bit of time on was a study that was done in 2017 by a huge study, thousands of kids, and it's in many different sites in different countries, run by Martin Hugman. And what they found conclusively, that there were 5 areas of the brain that were different in a kid with ADHD, conclusively. Now, if you look into the details of the study, what you find is that it's only 5% of the kids that she's finding some kind of issue with their brain, which means if you've got 100 kids in one room who've all been diagnosed with ADHD, only 5 of them will have anything indicating something wrong in their brain, a smaller frontal lobe or other areas. Here's the thing. She does not separate out medicated and unmedicated at all. So you have no idea what this 5% is. And that's irrelevant information as far as they're concerned in the study. The other thing that's really fascinating, and you don't even find it in the study, it's an add-on to the study, is that they found that kids with ADHD have on average higher IQs. So whereas, and that's on average, that means that it's over 50%, which is a big number. Whereas this 5%, which is as tiny sliver of a number, meaning you cannot use an MRI, fMRI, or any other technology to diagnose ADHD, because you're going to be wrong 95% of the time. So therefore, this study doesn't really prove the point. And when other researchers pushed back on her and said, Professor Hugman, if you're saying that a 5% finding means that conclusively people with ADHD have an altered mind, then that doesn't sound like a conclusive argument. It doesn't sound convincing. And she said, because I can't say to you, just because you have a tight chest, that you're having some kind of, God forbid, of course, some kind of heart issue. I have to check all the things, meaning that there's a good chance you're not having a heart attack. Right. So therefore, I must do a thorough checking. So when you're saying we have found conclusively that all kids with ADHD have a brain disorder, you're saying a false statement. And she responded, and I don't have the exact quote on me, but the response is so shocking. She responded, well, if the effect size is supposed to be 100%, then no psychiatric studies are reliable. There we have it. Another
baby out with the wash, huh?
Yeah, seriously, she just toppled psychiatry in one fell swoop. But it's interesting because leading psychiatrists, who I quote in my book, all are backing away from the notion that ADHD is neurological necessarily. They're all backing away from it, yet the literature keeps putting it out there. So you have the people who have actually been the organizers of the DSMs, who are saying, no, we can't prove that at all. But yet study after cheap, bad, non-scientific study after non-scientific study is being rolled out, and they're not announcing this stuff. They're not saying maybe this is not reliable. Maybe we should be looking somewhere else to help these kids. And a lot of these things are sponsored by pharma, which 100%. I think of psychiatric studies, I would go with 100% of them are funded in some way by pharma, as well as the DSM. The DSM is also is a 30%, I don't have the exact, it's about 30% of the DSM funding is coming directly from pharma.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I rail against all the time. I swear one of these days the pharmaceutical companies are going to put out a hit on me because I rail against the pharmaceutical companies. But it's sort of interesting because it, to me, goes back to, and I hate to wrap it up here, but we're going to have to time-wise. It goes back to the whole idea that ADHD is dysfunctional, that there's something wrong and it needs to be fixed. And so if we can figure out what's wrong in the brain, then we can develop a medication to fix it. And this is where I go to Stephen Tonti on his TED Talk, where he doesn't say it's dysfunctional. He says it's different. It's a different way of thinking and being in the world. And we need to be appreciated for the gifts that we have, because, I always tout ADHD. I said, I love it because I get a lot done where everybody else is just sort of pedantically going on about their way. I'm getting this done and that done and everything done, So anyway,
Right.
any
Well,
last?
I would add just one thing to that. I totally agree with it. And when you have an ADHD personality, which I call instant gratification personality, that is something that's genetic. It's not genetically problematic. It's a healthy personality type, which most of the people that are nearest and dearest, and I love most in the world, have that personality type. But ADHD symptoms are also caused by environmental triggers like diet, like a very dirty and chemically environment that our children are growing up in, like abuse, neglect, things like that. There's many other causes. So when we are looking at a person that's presenting with ADHD symptoms, it's really important to be asking the question, why is this person struggling? And really, it's very unimportant to answer the question, what does that person have? It's much more about, are they struggling because they have an instant gratification personality? In which case, we need to help them create habits and learn to follow structure and program and all that stuff, and kind of get them partnered with someone who's a little bit more organized. And then they both bring something magical to the partnership. Or if it's a trauma or an abuse or something physiological going on, we got to get in there too and help that person heal those things.
Absolutely. Thank you for those final words. Those were beautiful. Thank you so much. Abigail, what can I say? I hope you write another book so we can do this again.
I am done. 2 books. That's a lot. I've got 6 kids, 2 books, and a dog, and a husband. I feel like, but thank you so much. We could talk anytime. I'm always available for a chat with you.
Oh, I'd love that. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Abigail. Okay. Thank you for attending our session today of Oli's Therapy Corner, and we hope that you got something special out of it just for you. You take care, stay safe, and see you next time.